We have the haves and the have-nots, and this gap is always up for debate. How wide is it? How do we address it? Should we address it? The problems that follow on from it, and South Africa, in its capacity as holding the US presidency of the G20, is really putting this inequality debate to the fore again. President Cyril Ramaphosa appointed expert panel. It's got a task force to really dig into this global inequality issue to try and come up with some practical solutions. And the key word here is practical solutions for policymakers to start addressing these concerns. Now, for today's Markets Magnified podcast on global inequality, I'm joined by Dr. Azar Jammine. He is, of course, the Chief Economist and Director at Econometrix. Now, obviously, Azar, before you can address a problem, you need to understand the origin thereof. So where would you suggest this panel start digging to really get a good grasp on why this issue exists in the first place?
I think that there are a number of sources of inequality, and I don't believe that all people who address the issue actually go to the very heart of it, which is a microeconomic one. Instead, they tend to focus on the fact that there's a huge divide between developed and developing economies, and there is this concern that the developed economies are trying to impose their will on developing countries. Developing countries are acquiring a lot of debt, and the owners of that debt are usually from developed economies and demand high interest to be paid on a regular basis from these developing countries. And that creates a lot of tension between the two. And the most classic example of this right now is the pressures being put on developing countries to fund various actions to minimize climate change and to undertake investments that will see them becoming less pollutant, despite the fact that it's the developed economies and the newly industrialized economies of the Far East who are the main contributors towards this rising pollution. And so there's a classic example that I think this task force is going to tackle on the need to try and find a solution to how to help developing countries fund their debt that they incur under duress from developed economies to try and attack climate change. The other big obvious area of inequality is in respect of technological innovation. We know very well that there are only a few countries in the world that are leading technological innovation. And the problem is that this innovation is taking place at an accelerating rate, and it is leaving those who cannot climb onto the bandwagon further and further behind. And in many instances, that includes your least developed economies. So that in itself creates more and more inequality. And at a micro level, we see this in the form of the ability or inability of families to educate their children properly and appropriately to be able to make a contribution and add value in societies that are becoming increasingly technologically advanced and require a very acute acumen in areas such as numeracy, maths, science, and engineering. And what this leads to is a situation where your wealthier families are able to afford to send their children to the best schools, the best endowed schools, and acquire the better educations. So they end up with a vicious circle of rising inequality between those who can afford to educate their children properly and the majority who are unable to do so. So those are the general areas, especially now with artificial intelligence coming to the fore. This latter aspect is going to acquire increasing importance. But over and above that, there are some long-term microeconomic, structural, institutional factors, if one could call it, in the way the capitalist model works that I think are contributing to high levels of inequality. Firstly, around 50 years ago, President Nixon broke the bond between the dollar and gold, and this unleashed the ability on the part of global financial institutions to start lending money at an increasing rate. And what we have seen is a massive increase in indebtedness on the part of wealthy individuals, corporates, and governments at an accelerating pace, way out of line with the inflation rate. And that money, where has it gone to? It's gone to, a lot of it, to a corporate executive class around the world. How has that come about? This distinction, this break in the link between the dollar and gold tended to coincide, or was followed soon after, by massive technological advances, especially in financial technology, which enabled financial institutions to start measuring risk and developing risk models that could allocate credit far more readily on the basis of risk than ever before. And you saw the proliferation also at the time of unit trusts or mutual funds to replace the owner managed entrepreneurial company by companies that are now managed by these ghost asset managers who sit thousands of kilometers away from where the action is and dictate on the boards of these companies how they would like to see the maximization of profitability of these companies in the shortest space of time. These asset managers are competing with one another to yield the best returns available, and so are exerting extra pressure on boards of directors to ensure that their executive managers actually achieve these maximum profits or else are fired. And the way in which that incentivization takes place is the boards offer executives very fancy packages, and if they achieve stretched goals in profitability, they get an even fancier package. So the incentive is there for executive management to slash costs at all as far as they can, irrespective of who the supplier might be. Small businesses lose out quite badly as a consequence, small service providers, and instead more and more of the power and the financial nous is then in the hands of this executive class, who accumulate enormous amounts of wealth. And what do they do with that wealth? They also use a lot of it in share buybacks to take advantage of the abundance of liquidity through credit that is created. And this increases the earnings per share of these companies even further, and enhances the ability of these executives to earn even greater bonuses than previously. And this pyramid of wealth creation is becoming narrower and steeper all the time, to the extent now that we have a handful of global billionaires who have more wealth than the majority of individual countries in the world. Now, why this is all harmful is it is creating an increasing feeling amongst the have-nots of being alienated by a small and ever smaller group of people who are endowed with education and competence, who can dictate on whether the ordinary man in the street has a job or doesn't, and has a lowly pay, and he loses out badly. Politically, this is then translating into a massive polarization of society into very left-wing elements, populist elements, and very right-wing elements. And the ascent of Donald Trump to the presidency of the United States and the concomitant disruption that we have seen from his policies is a classical manifestation of this rise in inequality. And it's also contributing to more and more geopolitical tension between various countries. And one wonders where this is eventually going to end. So one asks, what are the solutions to this? And the answer is not very easy, because you virtually have to change the entire institutional model of capitalism to bring about an equalization of opportunities in the country. How you attack technological inequality is another big challenge. How do you improve education? These are challenges that have to be confronted, or else I think the world economy is faced with a very bleak future, because the more natural outcome of this growing divide is of a massive financial meltdown in the longer run that forces society to completely reorientate its institutional makeup.
Yes, of course, and we understand that the social unrest that could also spread from that, like you mentioned, holds severe implications, and it could be, it's very easy to become a breeding ground, like you mentioned, for populist policies, populist politicians perhaps coming to the fore, really riding on these issues of this disconnect between the poorer class and the more wealthier class. Obviously, there's always a lot of debate around global inequality, and there's one question in particular that always, tweaks my interest, and that's the question between fair and unfair inequality. Because you have income earners, high income earners, that extend their wealth by creating a product that will ultimately lift the social welfare of all. But you have unfair inequality where perhaps, and South Africa is a case in point of this, where you have corruption and political, we call them tenderpreneurs, increasing wealth without there being any benefit. In fact, I think it detracts from social welfare from a lot of the poorest of the poor, and that's why South Africa is known as the most unequal country in the world. So like you said, it's not an easy solution, because inequality is ultimately going to exist in, I think, any kind of capitalistic society. But managing it so it doesn't get to the point where you have the crisis is where it's going to come in. And when it's things like corruption that is really digging into this divide, it almost feels to me like addressing the social ills should already resolve a lot of the problems that we have that bring forth income inequality in like a country like South Africa. So I think it's it needs to be a basket of solutions, but it's not extremely difficult. It is difficult, but what I'm trying to say, it's like fixing the education system and making sure that's on par, making sure that there's no corrupt officials that win these tenders through under backdoor dealings. It's very straightforward solutions that just need to be implemented effectively, and we could perhaps make strides in resolving some of the inequality. Or am I thinking too simplistically about this now?
No, I think a lot of what you have said has enormous validity and is a manifestation of what is actually happening. But I think it goes deeper than that. The whole makeup of the way in which the corporate world in the capitalist society works has to be rejigged. And that is, I don't know quite what the solution is from a longer term point of view. But what you're seeing right now, and I think you highlighted at the start of what you said, when you said there is fair and unfair inequality. And I would say an entrepreneur who introduces new products or systems that add massive value to society actually deserve almost every cent that they actually earn. But what one is seeing is the enrichment of a managerial class who are, in a way, almost fortunate to be in the positions that they hold. And by virtue of holding those positions, are making a huge amount of money that often exceeds that of the original innovator and entrepreneur who has added the value. And one questions whether these managers are actually adding value or simply adding financial value, but at the expense of the well-being of the larger economy of the world and the majority of people.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a problem that we need to address. Azar, I think we've covered what we can. I know you thought about this a lot, so I don't know if there's anything else that you still wanted to perhaps give a tip or a hint to this task force, because they've got their work cut out for them, I think. And the other thing that's going to be tough for this panel is, it's one thing to focus on a country like South Africa, where we understand what is driving the equality to a certain extent. But what's driving inequality here might not be the same for other emerging countries, or even on the African continent. And I think that's what's going to make this task even more difficult. There's no blanket solution to all countries that's going to work the same.
Well, this is where there is some advantage in actually this being presented as a G20 problem and not simply as a G7 problem, because you do have societies in the G20 who are drawn from much poorer sections of the population, and who might well see the rising level of inequality in a completely different light from other members of the G20, who might see it more simplistically from a macroeconomic perspective. So yes, I think it is a big challenge, and I welcome this development, because I do believe that if we don't tackle it, this is the single biggest trend that could lead to global disaster in the longer term, long beyond my lifetime, but certainly maybe not yours.
Well, one hopes, Azar, one hopes. Yeah, so I think Professor Joseph Stiglitz and his team, they've got their work cut out for them. If they want more advice, they can find some good advice at Econometrix. Azar, but thank you so much for your time. I'm sure we will keep track on this, and perhaps, once the report is tabled, we can have a run through and just share some thoughts on their ideas on how to resolve this burning issue that really needs a solution ASAP, like you mentioned, before disaster strikes. Azar, thank you very much.